We are Today's Litches. I'm Valerie.
And this is Sheila.
And welcome to Sandwich Generation. So Sandwich Generation is a talk show, hot topics. Let's see, we get into the down and dirty, but in a very
respectful way.
Absolutely. If you're getting a lot of feedback, welcome to our new studio. And as you can see above us, we have this wonderful thing that has Today's Litches on it above us. However, we didn't account for the fact that we would be sitting down low. So next week that'll be fixed and you get to see everything.
Yeah, as our studio progresses, and as we progress, I guess, then so will everything else.
Right, so right now we're getting the video parts down. Now we're just working on the sound part.
Yes, and we are working on it. I think we're doing much better than we have in the past.
Yeah.
It's getting better. We have a little more work to do.
We sure do. So we're sisters, for those of you that don't know.
Yeah.
I'm Valerie.
Sheila.
And we are sisters. We are not twins.
No, we're a few years apart.
Yeah, I'm older, just for those of you.
Hi, Mom.
Oh, hi, Mom. Seen her on there. Don't you like having a big screen?
So, as you can tell, our parents are still with us.
Yes. And we have children.
Yes, and grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what makes us the Sandwich Generation, and that's where the perspective comes from.
Exactly.
From what it's like to be 50 years old and not a senior citizen, because they get talked about a bit, and then we're a younger generation. They tend to be talked about a lot. So
we kind of get left out. So we thought it would be interesting to put out our perspectives.
Yeah.
So tonight on our hot topic, as we're moving forward, we are still in our series on equality, and this started way back the beginning of January.
Oh,
the new year.
Yeah.
Because this is our 4th episode, and we are, it looks like we're going to be finishing out with First Nations.
That's right.
So for those of you who weren't following us before, or haven't seen the series, you can go to YouTube. They're all uploaded there. And we started the first week with equality, just kind of talking about it. Then we went to white privilege. Then we went to Black Lives Matter, and I felt, and so did Sheila feel, that it was really important to put First Nations in here too.
Because that was actually how it started, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
We wanted to actually...
It was my aha moment into white privilege, and it involved an Indigenous person, right? And that's when I realized that it wasn't really about being privileged, like having a trust fund or being looked after. It was more for me, and what I took from it, it was more about not understanding that the color of my skin had no obstacles.
Yes.
Right. And as I explained, I came to the realization that when I went on a job interview, I knew I was never concerned that the color.
I never thought about it either.
Yeah, no, and that's what I was saying to you. And then we sort of started talking about it. And then we got into Black Lives Matter because as we were offended by white privilege in the beginning, we were
also offended
by Black Lives Matter because the immediate assumption is that what?
Doesn't everybody's life matter?
Yeah. And so I think that's kind of where we went from, and now we're diving into First Nations.
And the reason why it's so important to dive into this is, first of all, I want you to understand that neither one of us are First Nations.
No.
So that is not something I'm going to speak like I have any kind of first-hand knowledge.
Or understanding.
Understanding of the place. But I do want to at least explain that some of the places that we do understand.
Yes.
And maybe find out from anybody if you feel like, one, the same way, but two, what maybe as a white-skinned individual who is not a First Nations individual, what can we do to make it better equality, more equal?
Right, and I think as we've been going through this series, one thing that keeps coming up, just like how this series got started, it got started because all of our hot topics that we were discussing, a lot of the underlying issues were equality issues.
Every time we came.
Every time, like if you got dug real deep, you could always find these equality issues. And one thing on this platform we agreed we would never do is, one, attack anybody for their opinion. We just ask everybody to be respectful.
Yeah, but you're allowed to have an opinion.
But you're allowed to have
just like we're allowed to have an opinion, but you still have to be respectful and maybe open up each other's eyes to our opinions. It's a good way of evolving opinions or learning from each other, is by discussing what we find is great.
Dad, Kathy, hi.
Hi.
Hi. Just looking, it's great because we have a big screen now, so we can be further away, but we can actually see what people are typing or whatever. I might even opt for a bigger one because as you get older, your sight isn't what it used to be. Either that or we get one hell of a magnifier.
Yeah, that's not just. So back to equality. That's where it all. Yeah. Really, when we got down to it, that's where it all came from. It stemmed every time we came up with a topic that we wanted to discuss. In the end, that topic went right back to equality. And it would go back to racism and how that affects equality. Right. And even the history behind all of it, because I think it's very important. And I think for those of you who have been participating through this whole series, when it comes right down to it, our history is very important for us. To learn not to water it down. No, we can learn from it. But to speak of it and learn from it. Because I think that's the way we move forward. Well, it's the only way to move forward. Days of just picking up the rug and sweeping everything under it and then, trying to tread lightly over it are gone. Yeah. And I just think that we need to be ignorance. It's not bliss. No, it isn't. No, it really isn't, because ignorance is just that. And I think within the reason why, for me personally, why Indigenous First Nations is kind of a personal crusade of mine is for the simple fact that the injustices that have been done to First Nations, and look, this doesn't diminish slavery or any of that. Any other injustice. And any crime against humanity is a crime against humanity. Is a crime against humanity. But the ongoing, and the misconceptions and the perceived notions that we have through media, social media, what we were taught in school, the books that we read in school, and all of that's changed, and we've moved forward in that change. And for a lot of us white-skinned people, we were comforted in the fact that we didn't view the world that way anymore. We were not racist. No. I'm just saying on my part, but we were comfortable and not really understanding that systemic racism still exists in a country like Canada today. Yes. And I think by acknowledging that and speaking up about it, that we can truly move to a form of reconciliation and a form of moving forward. But going through these series, we also came to two other conclusions. It just keeps getting deeper, really. And this is our two other reason. Yeah. One is social equality. Right. That you can't truly have equality in a nation as great as ours until we are all socially equal. We have the same rights, freedoms, and access to those rights and freedoms. Because that's not in the 21st century. That's not the truth. It's not in Canada, because there are communities that do not have access to the same rights and freedoms that every other community in Canada has. And I said,
So that was the first
That
one.
was the first part of
it, that we realized social equality is something that we really need to
discuss.
be moving forward with.
Yeah.
And then the second one was poverty.
Yes.
And it's a sad realization, but
opportunities are less if you are impoverished.
Or live in an impoverished community, right?
Right.
You don't necessarily have access to the social equality that other communities have.
Right.
And for instance, I mean, we kind of went into this a little deeper, like in school systems,
right.
Remember? And that's a whole other subject altogether.
Yes. That's a pretty bad one too.
Yeah, that's something we don't want to get into right now. But that's kind of where we were with it. And then with the Indigenous.
But also, I mean, our kids that went to school, my children that went to school, and their children are going to school. And I believe that they are getting a very watered down, or had gotten a very watered down version of the reality. I don't think that my kids were aware, nor was I until a little later, that the schools, residential schools were still happening. Like I thought, wow, in my head, that was something that happened in the history book that I saw in
like 200
years ago.
And we're not arguing the fact it actually happened 200 years ago.
We're just saying that we weren't even educated properly in our own school system as to what really happened. And our children got a watered down version as well.
Absolutely.
And I'm afraid that if we don't speak up as individuals, that my grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren are also going to continue with this watered down version of a reality, until finally we understand that it's only there as our history to learn from.
Recently, and because of Sandwich Generation and Grandkids Corner, we're on social media a lot more than I'd ever be in the past, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But I had saw a post from an Indigenous person, and I actually believe BC.
Might have been.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty sure it was BC. Anyway, very proud of his heritage and everything. Young man. Anyway, he was on a live. But before it went live, there was a picture of him, and then they had a caption of something somebody had written.
Okay.
And what it was, that if it wasn't for white man, you wouldn't have houses, and
something or other.
Yeah, just basically saying that you'd still be savages in the woods, or
like
whatever. Anyways, that was the gist of the comment. And then he responded by saying, but we would still have our culture. We would still have.
You evolve.
Yeah. And
as a people, with their culture, with all their beliefs, with their own medicine.
And he said, and there would still be bison roaming.
That's right.
And there would still be and so I get it, and it kind of makes you think. There's nothing, and I just want to make this perfectly clear. On my behalf, there is no amount of money, no amount of reconciliation, no amount of anything white man could do to make up for taking 5 generations away from them by kidnapping their children. And I mean, there's nothing that can ever make. I don't know how you move past that, because the reality is, if the shoe was on the other foot, how do you move?
Yeah.
How do you move past that? So they don't trust us. Yeah, I get that. I wouldn't trust us either, even though. And it's not that I.
But here's the thing, though, and this is where I'm coming from. I understand that we're in this place now, that they don't, most First Nations individuals that I know, like one-on-one, they'll sit and talk to you and that, but they honestly, a lot of them don't trust us as a peoples, and I mean as communities, like as governments.
Not necessarily
because we had
individual.
Yeah, not necessarily an individual.
Right.
What I'm saying, though, is if they don't trust us, at some point, how do we ever have this dialogue, open dialogue? How do we ever discuss any, like, I'm trying to figure out how we can discuss things and learn if we're so untrustable. In their eyes, not in.
And I'm not sure, and this is the
where
dialogue we wanted
having.
Right, and we wanted to have, and we did reach out, but we couldn't connect.
We actually just didn't connect in time.
To have somebody, First Nations, that.
And we might actually be able to.
And we may be able to, but we weren't able to get it done for this week. And, but I thought it was still important for us to have the conversation.
Yes.
We can only speak on our end,
yes.
right?
How do we, other than raising our children without those types of prejudices, and being open and stuff like that, how do we affect that?
But again, educating children that it is not embarrassing to have a ribbon dress.
No.
Right? That you should be proud. That's part of your culture.
Yes.
Right? I think that we need
education on our.
But that's just it. I think that we need to move forward. It's like we said, you were reading before about how the preconceived notion that, Native people have problems with alcohol.
Yeah.
Right?
But they don't even have the infrastructure to deal with any issues that they do have like that. And a lot of their old
and it's not like we don't have addictions issues.
Exactly. I mean, we have thousands of people dying from fentanyl every day in North America. So,
yeah.
But I guess what I'm saying is it seems more prominent, I think, in that community because they don't have the infrastructure to help fix any issues. They don't have that stuff available. It's not accessed. And so
but they should, and that's the frustrating part. The frustrating part is, why do I live in a great nation like Canada? Because I really do consider it a privilege to be Canadian. Why do I live in such a great nation, yet there are communities that do not have drinkable water in our most abundant resource that we have in this great nation of ours? It doesn't make any sense, especially in 2021.
Right.
Like, sewer systems, basic necessities of life, of which
we think. We thought were necessities of life.
See,
rights.
But I think it's all education. I really do, because we're just coming to the light.
Yes.
We're just coming to the understanding and the realization that, guess what? We are not all equal in this country. We aren't. No matter how much you want to purport to the whole world that we are not.
No.
And
we're not treated equal.
No.
If you, and especially for some reason, as a First Nations person.
But I think we need to talk about something about as a First Nation person. So I never really thought one way or the other until I moved to Alberta.
Yes.
And that's the truth. I'm going to say the truth, people. I have never seen so much systemic racism towards the Native population, right?
First Nations.
Our First Nations, our Aboriginal, Indigenous populations, nations here in Alberta. I've never seen so much racism in my whole life.
No.
Like, you can talk about Black Lives Matter, but in Alberta, it's bad.
It's systemic, and it seems like it's First Nations.
It's First Nations.
And I think here, especially in Alberta, people don't seem to call it out as much.
No, they don't actually. They participate a lot.
Yeah, like I just find it really
actual, like, I've never seen as much of it as in Alberta. And you've lived in 4 provinces. I've lived in 3.
Well, I can say this: when I lived in BC, I did find but it was not a derogatory thing. It wasn't a bad thing to be First Nations. It was something to be proud of in BC.
Okay.
Here, it seems like they speak derogatory. They speak
Even
poorly of First Nations people. And then I think, though, that the same thing exists in some parts of Ontario, from what I've gathered in the past or heard.
Our younger years, we were born, and our younger years were
In Ontario.
Southern Ontario.
Right.
Okay. And then we moved to Nova Scotia.
Correct.
Right, later years.
Yeah.
And myself personally, I pretty much stayed
Until
there and like my whole adult life until about 14, 15 years ago, we moved to Grand Prairie, Alberta.
Right.
You had moved, like, you then
I
went to Alberta, then you were in BC, then you were, so you lived all over
provinces, and
right.
And it seems to me that the racism, the systemic racism,
right,
towards First Nations, Aboriginals, individuals is much stronger here in Alberta.
And I'm not sure.
And when I lived in Nova Scotia, I would say the racism was
more
black.
Yeah, and that's true. Nova Scotia, it seemed to be more racism towards the black population. And here in Alberta, it's more towards the First Nations populations. And I noticed it, and it's funny, I'll never forget this. I had lived in Edmonton briefly in 1990 for a period of 8 months, and my daughter was really little, just a baby, and she was sick, and I took her to the walking clinic, right? Yeah. Which was not used to because they didn't have those things in Nova Scotia.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
No walking clinic.
No. So anyways, I went to the walking clinic and she was so sick. She's just clinging to me. And this nice elderly lady was sitting beside me because like this was, 31 years ago.
Yeah.
Anyway, and there was, I didn't even notice, there was a couple of little children playing on the floor. And I was holding my daughter and trying to console her, and this elderly lady leaned over and said to me, "Oh my God, isn't that disgusting?" And I'm like, "What?" And she goes, I won't say what she called them, those native children, right? Yeah, they just let them play all over the floor. They don't even care about their own kids. And I'm like, I never heard anything like this before in my life. And then I'm sitting there thinking, if my daughter was well,
she'd be on
the floor playing with them, right? And what's wrong with that? Anyways, and that was my first experience of racism towards First Nations.
I know.
Absolutely. I've never seen anything like it before. And I mean, I know Nova Scotia is having some issues right now. With respect to their oceans and fisheries.
And the treaties.
And their treaties and First Nations and commercial lobster fishing. And we really don't want to get into any of that right now. But the reality
is too short for that.
Yeah, too short for that. But we did want to bring up the systemic racism.
And what do we mean by that? How do you want to explain that?
Explain what?
The systemic racism. How you can see it. It's
blatant.
It's very blatant.
Mm-hmm.
I think places. I think employment.
Oh yeah.
Education.
Yeah.
Access to education.
Yes.
And
program services available in most communities here.
Yeah.
The other thing is that's another thing I didn't realize. I knew there were different nations. I really did. But when you're on the East Coast, the only nation is Mi'kmaq. Right?
Yes.
Okay. So I came here and I remember I was at the brand new opening of the Calgary courthouse.
Oh.
And they actually have like a courtroom just for First Nations when it's called a sentencing circle.
Okay.
Anyway, so we were in there and looking around and everything. And I actually remember thinking to myself, I said, how many nations are there in Alberta? right, thinking,
Yeah.
2?
No.
There's 11.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, I had no idea, right, of all the different nations in Alberta.
There's a lot of nations, and I do know that, and I do know, like, the stuff, anybody who is white knows and can see and has been familiar with the racism. Everybody, if you're white, you know of it, you've seen it, you're aware of it. I guess the only thing we can do is call it out. In my opinion, it's like, what else do you do when you hear it?
Right. So, for instance, back in 1990, because that's exactly when that incident happened.
Yeah.
Right. I did call it out in my own way. I wasn't direct about it.
Yeah.
Right. I was like, well, and I said to her, because I really didn't know what she was getting at. I said, well, if she was feeling better, she'd probably be down there playing too. Right? I didn't know what to say, but in my own way, I made my point.
Yeah.
Right? That it didn't matter what color or where the kids came from.
No.
They were doing what a lot of kids do in a doctor's office on the floor with toys, play.
Yeah.
Right?
A lot of doctors' offices got rid of toys. Did you know that? Because of the spread of germs and stuff.
No, I get that.
I noticed it in the last few years.
Yeah, and sure, well, now they're gone for sure. Never to be seen again, people. No more toys in the doctor's offices. But anyways, just like your plexiglass, get used to it.
Yeah.
But the reality is that it is very blatant here in Alberta.
It really
very,
is.
very blatant.
It really is.
And it's scary how blatant it is here in Alberta.
I think so too.
And I've met some amazing, amazing Aboriginal people from different nations through my prior work. And I'm always curious. I always ask questions. And I remember I was talking with an elder, and she wanted her real last name back. So this is another thing the government did, is they walked in to reserves and changed their last names. You're a good swimmer. Who does that? Yeah. Literally changed their last names. Yeah. And legally, that's their last name. And I'm like, are you kidding me? So they had documents, they brought in documents after documents going back to what the real last name is. And I think it was Charlemagne or something like that. But anyway, and I'm like, wow. And it was done in the 50s. That's here in Alberta. I can't speak anywhere else. People I don't know about anywhere else. No. But the thing is
like we said, we're not First Nations and we can't speak like we are.
We
can talk to you about our own. We can only explain it from our perspective.
Right. And from actually not getting the watered down version of our history in school. Yeah. Right?
And I know when I see, because I got to know people when I lived in Nova Scotia or in BC on the Squamish Nation, I learned a lot about their culture and how their pride in their culture. Right. And I understand why they tend to have stronger nations in BC, is partly because they have that pride and haven't been so although yes, in BC it still happens, and yes, it's very important to notice. What I'm saying though is maybe their pride has helped them sustain their culture.
That's a good question. That would be a great question for a First Nation panel. Yeah. Because even within their nations, right? And that they have different nations, different cultures. So I think it's really difficult for us to speak on subjects that
we don't know anything about. It's like treaties. We had talked about that. I said, right. I understand that we've signed treaties and that we need to abide by treaties. It's a legal document also, by the way. Yes. But I also think it's only in good standing. It's only the right thing to do. Right. Is to abide by the treaties that you've made.
So why don't we check our time, and why don't you talk a little bit about, just a second.
Actually, I think it is time.
Yeah, I think it is time. I knew this was gonna happen, I knew it.
We got a few minutes.
About what's going on in Australia.
Oh, yeah.
With that was on the news.
Yeah,
remember?
that they were wanting $1 million and each for each.
They're Indigenous, First Nations.
They call them Indigenous.
Do they, or Aboriginal? They call them Aboriginal.
That's right.
I forgot. But I guess I don't know. You're the
no, it was $1 million. They were looking for $1 million for each Black individual. And the Indigenous people believe it to be true that they should be getting $1 million. And today is also each person. But I mean, for me, I'm like, wow, that's a lot of money. I don't know anything.
But didn't you say the option to go back to
they were like, and then they wanted to be able to pay for their own option as to whether or not they want to go back and recreate a life in there. They were like, most of them, we had said that no, they would not want to do that.
Right.
But a few of them said they would like the opportunity. I guess what I'm saying though is that this is our First Nations land. Canada is for our First Nations land, and U.S.
is their First Nations land.
I mean, like each country seems to have a First Nation. Each country or continent has a First Nation. Yeah. A first Aboriginal or Indigenous to that country. Area.
Oh, by the way, which they were not Indigenous. They actually came up and down.
Yeah.
And then, but yes.
Yeah.
Anyways, going back to the good old days where First Nations and the establishment, well, basically it was like anything else. Conquer.
Yes.
Conquer. That's what it was.
Yes.
It's the same way the British went into India and
every other.
And like you said, there's
why there were French colonies.
The difference between us and the U.S. is that we have the same parents.
Yes.
The French and the English originally, right? We have the same parents besides the Indigenous populations, right? Canada and the U.S. has the same parents. The difference is when the U.S. grew up, they decided to move out on their own. They kicked the parents to the curb. We stayed in the family. Right? That's all. We remained tied to the family. They separated from the family. That's the only difference, right?
Yeah. Okay, Missy. Okay. It's that time. We need to let them know about a few things.
Okay.
And let me just double check. Actually, it is that time.
I tried to tell you.
I knew it. It always is. We get chit-chat and then we don't shut.
Okay, so after this, every Wednesday, we are live on YouTube at 6 p.m.
Right.
Half-hour segment program. We also go live on TikTok.
Yes.
And we go live on Facebook with Sandwich Generation.
That's right.
TikTok's at 7, Facebook's at 8.
Yep.
Also, on top of that, we blog. We put out 5 blogs a week, and you can find that at 2daysLitches.com.
And don't forget
Grandkids
Corner. We do that every Friday
at 4
o'clock.
YouTube.
It becomes available at 4 o'clock.
Yeah.
And
it's our adventures for the grandkids, children. We just have fun with them, and
we miss them.
We miss them. We started out virtual play, turned into virtual fun.
Right.
So that's what we have going on. So come check us out, like and subscribe. See you guys next week.
Bye.
Bye, y'all.